From the exterior, 3 Moorhouse Street appeared to be an ordinary home nestled in C.O.AG, a Fremantle suburb of the city of Perth, Western Australia. However, behind its walls lurked a dark truth. Over the span of 5 weeks in the spring of 1986, David and Catherine Burney kidnapped 5 women, sexually assaulted and killed 4, with the 5th managing to escape their clutches before alerting authorities of the killer couple's abhorrent crimes. David John Burney, the eldest among 5 siblings, was raised in Wattle Grove, a semi-rural suburb of Perth. Childhood acquaintances recall his family as troubled, plagued by rumours of alcoholism, promiscuity and incest. Regular family meals were non-existent, with Burney's parents neglecting to cook for their children. Their home was, quote, notoriously filthy. During the early 1960s, Burney's family relocated to another Perth suburb. It was there that he met Catherine Harrison, his 12-year-old next-door neighbour, who struck up a relationship with him at 14. At the age of 15, David left school to begin an apprenticeship as a jockey at the nearby Ascot racecourse. While working there, Burney subjected the horses to physical abuse and engaged in exhibitionism. One night, he broke into the room of an elderly woman who stayed at the same boarding house as him, wearing only stockings over his head in an attempted sexual assault. He was subsequently fired from his position at Ascot. In his adolescence, Burney had already been in and out of prison for various offences of different severity, and he and his siblings had jumped from foster home to foster home. As an adult, he struggled with addiction to sex and pornography, along with paraphilic behaviour. By his early 20s, he married and had a daughter. Catherine Margaret Harrison, born on May 23, 1951, lost her mother, Doreen, during childbirth when Catherine was just 2 years old. Tragically, her newborn brother also passed away 2 days later. Unable to care for Catherine in South Africa, her father, Harold, who had abused her, entrusted her to her maternal grandparents who resided in Perth, Australia. However, at the age of 10, a custody dispute arose, leading to Harold regaining sole custody of Catherine. Despite her father's pleas, Catherine continued her troubled relationship with David Burney, leading to encounters with law enforcement and imprisonment during her teenage years. Advised by a parole officer, she worked as a housekeeper for the McLaughlin family and later married Donald McLaughlin. They had 7 children, but tragically lost their firstborn son, Donnie, in infancy. In 1985, Catherine left her husband and children to be with David, legally changing her surname to Burney. They then settled in C.O.AG, where David worked at a car wrecker's shop, which was a 4-minute drive from their residence on Moorhouse Street. The Burney's neighbours often saw the quiet couple smoking cannabis, taking heroin, and abusing prescription drugs. David requested sex from Catherine up to 6 times per day in order to achieve regular gratification. David continued to commit theft and ended up behind bars again, during which time he developed a dark, twisted fantasy to commit rape and murder. Following his release, he asked Catherine to help him lure a potential victim to their home, and she willingly agreed. In September of 1986, David placed an advertisement in the local newspaper which read, "Urgent, looking for a lonely person, prefer female, 18 to 24 years, share single-room flat." Shortly after the ad was placed, the Burneys found their first victim. Mary Nielsen, a 22-year-old psychology student and part-time delicatessen worker at the University of Western Australia, crossed paths with David at a car wrecker's shop. where he offered her cheap tyres at his home, and the pair exchanged phone numbers. On October 6, 1986, Nielsen visited Moorhouse Street to take David up on his offer. However, David, accompanied by Catherine, subjected Nielsen to a harrowing ordeal, gagging, chaining, and sexually assaulting her. Subsequently, they transported her to Gleneagle State Forest, where David strangled her with a nylon cord and stabbed her under the mistaken belief that it would accelerate decomposition. Catherine aided in burying Nielsen in a shallow grave. 15-year-old, straight-A high school student Susanna Candy from Nedlands was abducted 2 weeks after Nielsen while hitchhiking along Claremont's Stirling Highway. Once she entered the Barneys' car on October 20th whilst leaving her restaurant job, Candy was bound and held at knife point. Initially, Susanna believed the Barneys to be trustworthy, as she felt reassured by the presence of another female in the vehicle. The Barneys then coerced her into sending reassuring letters to her family, stating she was spending time away to, quote, deal with her problems, before subjecting her to a similar ordeal as Nielsen at their home on Moorhouse Street. Following an unsuccessful attempt to strangle a resisting Susanna with a nylon cord, the Barneys forcefully administered sleeping pills. When they took effect, David instructed Catherine to demonstrate her love by killing Candy herself. Catherine complied, murdering Candy while David watched, later describing the emotions of her first kill as, quote, I did not feel a thing. Subsequently, Susanna was buried near Nielsen's shallow grave, near a picnic site in Gleneagle State Forest. On November 1st, Nolene Patterson, 31, ran out of fuel on Canning Highway after her shift as a bar manager at Nedlands Golf Club. The Barneys pulled over and picked her up from the side of the road, Patterson having met them a few weeks prior when they assisted in wallpapering her house in Swan River. The Barneys took her back to their residence, a knife pressed against her throat, and David sexually assaulted her. Nolene was chained to the bed, gagged and repeatedly raped over the following 3 days, where she was held captive. David developed a likeness towards Patterson and was therefore reluctant to kill her on the night they abducted her. His emotional bond with Nolene resulted in Catherine harbouring immense jealousy towards their victim. When Catherine demanded David act after 3 days of delays, David chose to kill Patterson by overdosing her with sleeping pills and strangling her in her sleep. They buried her separately in Gleneagle, with Catherine taking pleasure in disrespecting Nolene by throwing sand across her face. Just days later, on November 5th, the Barneys abducted a 21-year-old computer operator and babysitter Denise Brown from a Stirling Highway bus stop by Coolbellup Tavern. Like previous victims, she was taken at knife point and assaulted at the Barney home, where David and Catherine forced her into calling her parents and telling them that she was okay. The next day, they drove her to the Nangara pine plantation, where David raped her in their car. Afterward, he sexually assaulted her again and stabbed her in the neck and chest. Believing her to be dead, they buried her in a shallow grave, but Brown unexpectedly sat up. David then struck her twice with a shovel and an axe before burying her again. On November 9th, 17-year-old Kate Moyer was abducted at knife point after accepting a ride from the Barneys after a night out with friends. Quote, I've got the munchies. Have you got the munchies? Catherine uttered to David, this being their secret code that they had found their next victim. David held a knife to her throat and coerced her into calling her mother, pretending she was staying at a friend's house after drinking too much. She hoped her mother would realise something was awry, as she didn't ever get drunk. Kate later recalled asking the Barneys if they planned to harm her, to which they responded, quote, We'll only rape you if you're good. She was forced to dance for them and spend the night handcuffed to David's ankle in their bed, watching the Rocky film on VHS and smoking cannabis. She was then forced to shower several times before being raped again and was made to write goodbye letters to her family. David then administered sleeping pills. However, Kate hid them under her tongue and hid them under the mattress when the Barneys weren't looking. The day after David left for work, Catherine forgot to chain Kate to the bed when she answered a knock at the door. Kate managed to break the lock of a nearby window, but injured herself in the process. After seeking help from neighbours and being attacked by David's dog, she fled to a nearby vacuum cleaner shop and reported the incident. Despite initial scepticism from some officers, 22-year-old Constable Laura Hancock believed Kate's detailed account from the start, which included her description of David's distinctive mustard-coloured dressing gown, the chains tied to the bed, the Rocky VHS tape, and a hidden drawing within the residence. The Barneys had adopted aliases, but Kate discovered David's real name on a medicine bottle. Kate described both Barneys in great detail, David as having an abnormally long, hooked nose, and Catherine as a short woman with a permanent frown and high cheekbones. There was no denying that Kate had suffered at the hands of the Barneys. When police initially knocked at 3 Moorhouse Street, nobody answered the door. Catherine had gone out looking for Kate following her escape and was fearful of the repercussions from David after she failed to secure Kate's chains. She was arrested upon her return, and David was arrested at his place of work. Police found all of the items Kate had described within the Barney residence. However, upon their arrests, both Barneys gave conflicting statements regarding Kate. Catherine denied knowing her, whereas David said their interactions were voluntary and consensual. By that afternoon, homicide detectives believed the Barneys to be linked to the 4 missing women in the area and questioned them extensively. Detective Sergeant Vince Katich spoke with David and advised him to confess and disclose the burial locations of the previous victims, to which he agreed willingly without hesitation. Catherine was told of David's confession, to which she too admitted her guilt. On the edge of a pine grove in Nangara, near Pinjar, 30 kilometres north of Perth, the detective team made a grim discovery late that night. Among the trees, the naked remains of Denise Brown were found, having laid there for almost a week. Before sunrise, the homicide squad travelled through Perth and 80 kilometres south to another location in the Gleneagle forest. David initially struggled to locate the other 3 graves, but eventually guided them to a spot for digging. 2 bodies were found, later identified as Mary Nielsen and Susanna Candy. Chillingly, Catherine insisted on showing them the final grave. They returned to the highway and followed another track to discover Nolene Patterson's body, covered with gravel. Catherine, once again fueled by jealousy, spat on the body upon its recovery. On November 12th, Catherine and David Barney were charged with 4 counts of murder, 2 counts of aggravated sexual assault, and deprivation of liberty. Detectives began considering the possibility of additional victims and launched further investigations, specifically into the disappearances of Cheryl Rennick and Barbara Western, both of whom also vanished in 1986. However, earlier in the year, in May and June, 5 months prior to the Barneys' known killing spree. 12-year-old Lisa Marie Mott, who vanished in 1980, was also a possibility, but David's first wife gave him an alibi. Western's body was found in Carrigullen in 1991, however her killer has never been found. Both Rennick and Mott remain missing. The next day, a team of workers and excavators inspected sections of a drain near the Barneys' house on Harrison Street. Months earlier, bone fragments, shoes, and women's underwear had been found by workers laying pipes in the same area. Despite a thorough search lasting for hours, no further evidence was discovered. In February 1987, Catherine and David Burney pleaded guilty to all charges during a hearing. Justice Alkin Wallace sentenced David to life in prison without parole, emphasising the premeditated and cruel nature of the crimes. Catherine received the same sentence, but with the possibility of parole after a minimum term of 20 years. Justice Wallace stressed that she should serve a strict security life imprisonment without exception. After the sentencing, Catherine Burney was taken to Bandy Up prison, resisting and shouting. In court, members of the public reacted strongly to David Burney, who chillingly responded with a smile and blew them a kiss before being escorted to the maximum security jail, Fremantle Prison. In 2016, Kate Moyer, the woman who managed to escape the Burneys, initiated a movement to abolish Western Australian laws mandating parole consideration every 3 years for convicts. By 2017, Catherine's youngest son, Peter, advocated for her execution due to the physical assaults he endured because of his association with her. Peter also aligns with Moyer's advocacy efforts. In prison, David's violent behaviour persisted, leading to fights and frequent stays in the infirmary. Eventually, he was placed in solitary confinement to avoid harm from other prisoners. Catherine regretted her actions, missing her partner and feeling responsible for their capture. Over 4 years, the couple exchanged over 2,500 letters from their jail cells. However, eventually their relationship dried up, and Catherine severed ties with David, in the hopes it would better her chances for parole. On October 7th, 2005, now 54-year-old David Burney was found dead in his cell 12A at Casuarina Prison, having hanged himself from an air vent using a sheet. According to officials, various factors led to his suicide, including incorrect supply of antidepressants after Catherine cut all contact with him, confiscation of the computer in his cell after pornography was found on it, and the fact he was suspected of sexually assaulting a fellow inmate. Following his death, Catherine was not allowed to attend the funeral. Nobody claimed his body, and he was buried in a pauper's grave. Catherine remains incarcerated and has had a number of parole applications rejected. She claims her actions were executed due to her deep-rooted infatuation with David and would stop at nothing to prove her love for him. The case was reviewed in 2009, and it was decided by the Attorney General that, in the best interests of the victims' families, Catherine would never be released, making her only the third Australian woman ever to have never be released written on her papers.